Namaste. Namaste and greetings. I, Ritika Sundar, a researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti, Anusandhan Sansthan, Nai Delhi, warmly welcome you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered for a special talk on the topic Disenfranchised Migrants and the City, Theory and Evidence by Professor Ashwani Kumar. This talk is a part of the series The State of Cities #City Conversations, which is organized by IMPRI, City for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies. And today, it is my honor to introduce the speaker. Professor Ashwani Kumar is a researcher and presently Dean of School of Development Studies at Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Professor Kumar has served as a member of Central Employment Guarantee Council. Sir is also the author of Community Warriors, and he has co-edited Power Shifts and Global Governance and served as one of the chief editors of Global Civil Society, Poverty and Activism at the London School of Economics. Sir has also recently co-edited Migrants, Mobility and Citizenship in India. Welcome, sir. The moderator of the series is Dr. Saumyadeep Chattopadhyay, Associate Professor, Vishwa Bharati University, West Bengal, and Senior Visiting Fellow, IMPRI, New Delhi. We are fortunate to have discussants for today's deliberation. Welcome, sir. Welcome, ma'am. They are Dr. Srishtee Sethi, Research Fellow, Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration, Mussoorie, Professor Bhagirathi Panda, Professor of Economics, Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, Honorary Director, ICSSR, Northeastern Regional Center, Shillong, and Dr. Arvind Pandey, Assistant Professor, School of Public Policy and Governance, Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad. We look forward to learning from our distinguished speaker and eminent panelists, and we look forward to a quite enriching deliberation. With that, I invite Professor Ashwani Kumar to begin his presentation. Welcome, sir.
Oh, I'm really delighted here because this is a brilliant opportunity to connect to my friends and also, people who are interested in migration. And first of all, I thank Dr. Arvind Kumar for inviting me, Director of IMPRI, who is doing excellent, rather stellar work in terms of policy-related, advocacy, research, so on and so forth. And I'm really grateful to my discussants here who have willingly and on a very short notice joined the panel. Look forward to interacting with everyone, listening to everyone. So what I'm going to do that I will make a short presentation and I'm going to share my PPT here. Hopefully I'm able to share the PPT. Yeah, so it's yes, the screen. I'm here. Yeah. Should I go? Yeah, full screen.
It's on. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So now here, and that's what I'm going to talk about. The presentation today I'm going to talk about is based on two things. So let me preface my presentation today. The work that I'm going to present here, Disenfranchised Migrants, in-city theory and evidence, largely revolves around my 7-8 years, or perhaps my decadal engagement with the Election Commission of India, where I first got into as a political scientist when I started working with Election Commission. I started giving more attention to the voting rights of migrants and migrant workers. So my thanks to election commissioners, various election commissioners, and especially, Chief Election Commissioner, Mr. Jayati, who really encouraged me to look at, enfranchisement of migrants in terms of the lack of voting rights more closely. And secondly, also with Professor Bhagat, we have just published, and Dr. Sethi has also contributed one brilliant chapter here. And the book is titled Migrants, Mobility and Citizens of India. The South Asia edition will be shortly released in India next month. So part of my presentation revolves around a decadal work. And you have been hearing about NRI voting rights, internal migrants voting rights, some of my pieces floating here and there as op-ed also. So that's kind of one piece of puzzle that I want to share with you, that what I'm going to present here. So this is, and second is, the more complex, detailed theoretical and empirical analysis is available in the book, Migrants, Mobility and Citizenship in India. Where Professor Bhagat and I collaborated and put together a book on analyzing citizenship and migrants in India. To begin with, if you look at, and those who are familiar with, my works particularly, I lean a lot on interdisciplinarity, learn a lot from, different works carried out in sociology, anthropology, geography, economics. But what I'm going to present here is pretty much rooted into my own discipline, what I call my disciplinary home political science. So I'm not going to, give you a sense of, and I assume that you're familiar with, geographers debates, economists debates, and I expect, a very eminent economist, Professor Panda, is around it. So I'm sure he will reflect on Harris and Todaro model, push and pull models, and other models available to explain, migration and mobility. And just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, because I tried to do some 8 years back, 7-8 years back. I guess Dr. Srishtee will recall, we organized a almost international conference. Though we called it national conference, where we invited leading experts from around the world to just look at and revive, the great iconic, work of Myron Wiener, Sons of the Soil Thesis. So that way you can imagine where I'm coming from. So what I'm trying to do here, the way I conceptualize, you can get a sense that my conceptualization is very deeply rooted into, like reviving, rehabilitating, and also, looking at how Myron Wiener's classic works continues to inform us about understanding migrants and mobility in the country and also in the larger context of the world around us. So I look at, I look at migration these days until, and my confession to all of you that COVID has given us a new perspective, because until COVID, many of us tended to, look at migration or migrants more in terms of what I have highlighted, optimistic views. Because if you're a student of migration studies, you could look at how developmentalist optimism in the 50s, and then structuralist and new Marxist pessimism, in terms of the world systems theory and dependency theories, to now, in the 90s, when we started looking at what I call renaissance of optimistic. But the COVID has given a big challenge. The COVID has brought us back to the square end, where we are trying to look at, how we can understand this huge crisis, the huge crisis, which will become very clearer, once I, present the entire material. Back here, as I mentioned at the very outset, that I'm kind of, trying to look at modernization pieces, or also, looking at, various patterns of what I call neo-modernization theory. And neo-modernization theory comes across in various forms in the migration studies. Largely, if you look at, the literature, more optimistic literature, they are very, very, although they look at discrimination, they look at the, exclusion, they look at, lack of welfare rights for migrants, but they are more, more optimistic in terms of neo-modernization thesis. What I mean by neo-modernization thesis is that, going back once again, Weiner's classic work in 1978, when Myron Wiener posited the thesis that modernization provides incentives and opportunities for mobility and creates conditions for increased internal migration. The outcome in terms of the modernization theory was pretty simple, that it leads to more opportunities for migrants, So let us look at, and also what he famously called intense conflict over protection of a space. Professor Panda is from Northeast. I look forward to learning from him about Northeast. We have a very decent chapter in our book on Northeast migrants and migration, but we hear less about protection of a space and violent conflict over protection of a space in Northeast. Of late, maybe in 2 days back, you have just seen a violent conflict between Assam and Mizoram. So I look forward to learning from Professor Panda what's happening there in the Northeast. Disenfranchised internal markets. I guess when I first, you need to go back to some of the works we carried out rather accidentally, very modestly, and with politeness, which is becoming rarer in academia and in politics too. But I must confess that accidentally we discovered, when Election Commission invited us to work on internal migrants and their voting rights, we discovered this fact, disenfranchised internal migrants. And then I went back to my own work, earlier work, community warriors, where I was looking at a more Tocquevillian thesis of democratization in India. So what I considered while working for Election Commission in terms of, analyzing disenfranchised internal migrants, that disenfranchised internal migrant is a sort of, continuing democratic deficit, which many of us, neither policymakers nor scholars, have recognized it. It's very difficult. We are now working on another book, and the challenge that I, sharing with editors of the book, that there is hardly any material. There is hardly any essay on how and why, this situation has emerged. So this is where our contribution is significant, although it's very small, little contribution, but the initial report that we shared with Election Commission in 2015 and 16, we are happy that it is becoming a sort of a global template, because recently in the leading, Journal of Political Science, APSR, has, quoted us extensively while debating disenfranchised internal migrants in the world. So what I'm going to say here, I'm leaning onto the work of my fellow political scientists in the US, Bhavanani and Thachil, and going back to Weiner. And I would also come back and tell you about the recent brilliant research done by Gaikwad and Nellis. So the political exclusion, what I'm trying to conceptualize in the book and also through various other works that I'm engaged with currently, is the idea of political exclusion of migrants in democracies. That's something needs to be theorized by democratic theorists and philosophers as well. What we hear from geographers, demographers, and economists, that political exclusion is not on the agenda. So that's where Bhavnani Thachil is a very young political scientist, done exemplary work on migrants. So they all agree that political exclusion of migrants is commonplace. It's not just happening in India, various places. India, the reality. So in India, they have often been treated like second-class citizens. Many of us today, you, me, and many of us are migrants, but some of us are privileged migrants. But I'm also looking at second-class, unprivileged, undomiciled, migrants as disenfranchised citizens of the country. So that's kind of, preface that you can get a sense. I will be speaking less on the data part because, in the COVID, many of us, and also in the COVID, I wrote about it. So the data part is familiar with you. But the, good news or bad news, the good news that because of the COVID, there is a gauge on migrants. There is a gauge, gauge on patterns of migration and mobility in India. But if you just look at the data part, you can see that in the next census is due this year, but I'm sure that is not going to happen for a couple of years. But you can imagine that how, just look at the number, whatever way the number has been collected, and demographers, geographers, and economists are far more conversant with the numbers. So they can tell you that 450 million to 580 million, it is my approximation and estimation that in the next census, the migrants numbers would be around 580 million. And the bad news, if you look at, in terms of the governmentality of the migration, The district level data we don't have. Professor Panda is here. He knows my engagement with the districts over the last 10 years, because unless we know the district patterns, districts mobility patterns, it's very difficult to cross-check the data or sanitize the data. So there are studies available. People are working on different ways on migration and analyzing migration data. Indian migration report, South Asia migration report. So there are many things happening around migrants and migration or mobility, studying mobility patterns. But what is missing here? The missing is here the focus on disenfranchised migrants. What I call deficit of democracy, deficits of citizenship. It's very, very important to look at, that when my more, what I call people who look at migration as accumulation strategy, those who have developed this model of, optimistic model that migration provides opportunities for livelihood and social and economic enhancement. They also need to look at, that if you look at, the forms of migration and the patterns of the migration or composition of migration in India, you will find that, like last year, those who were walking back, and they mainly, came from poorest and social marginalized groups. So what I'm trying to suggest here, that there is an overrepresentation of bonded, child labor, Adivasis, Dalits, and lower, OBC. So you can look at, the pyramid of the, the migrants, the bottom layer, So it's kind of, there is a class and caste, a tale that you can find here. This is here, yeah. So now back here, where I, give you more sense of, what I call democratic deficit or citizenship deficit, So if you just look at, 900 million plus eligible voters, just look at, and if you look at stunning record of India's democracy in terms of procedural democracy, high rate and good turnout, But the fact is that we have never done that analysis of how many migrants are missing from the voting. So this is where one of the procedural issues that we have been working with the ECI and trying to help ECI to expand the definition of the procedural legal definition of ordinarily resident. So the good news that EC has of late, kind of liberalized this clause, ordinarily resident, and allowed that even seasonal and temporary migrants can be allowed to be registered, for voting at the location and habitat away from ordinary place of residence. So when you look at, according to our estimation, the temporary migrants, the seasonal migrant, the circular migrants, the short-term migrants, according to our estimate, between, about 150 million to 200 million people. So you could imagine the extent of, and the depth of democratic deficit. But the exclusion continues. In fact, our own work over years, we collected the data, we analyzed the data, and we found out, you can see that Kumar LTS report, Election Commission report, where we pointed out that 60 and 83% of domestic migrants, internal migrants, failed to cast a ballot in at least one national, state, or local election after. This was a stunning discovery. And this made us to, analyze, the problem of disenfranchisement, perhaps more deeply. But back here from India, I'm taking you to the other parts of the world, this is something in the literature, in migration literature, we don't hear often, there are many countries, there are many democracies facing the similar situation that we face here. But since there is a kind of definitional issue here, that they study migrants more as immigrant, and we study our migrants more as domestic and internal migrants, But if you look at the literature, you will find that most places, in most cities, because when Arjun told me to, think through the topic, I told him that, look, I'm going to present this material more in terms of city analysis, so that there is a wider canvas, So if you look at the wider canvas of, cities around the world, you will find in most cities, the new migrants in the cities are facing similar situation, the lack of welfare rights, and concomitantly, they also face the situation of lack of citizenship rights or voting rights more precisely. So if you look at the evidence, the evidence of, those who shift from the countryside to cities participate in destination area politics at lower rates rather than, local born residents, the so-called native residents. This shortfall matters also normative. You can see my focus, I'm also looking at the normative aspects of democracy because democracy promises equal representation. So that's where my call for, far more deeper analysis and extensive analysis by democratic theorists, that it really cutting into going against, the very normative process of democracy, the representation promise. And secondly, this is a familiar part, but I share with you based on the recent literature around the world that social groups not exercising suffrage, experience a statement. So the neglect that migrants suffered during the COVID was not a news for researchers, perhaps, although it was a tragic news for many of us. So if you look at Costa Rica, if you just change the place in Costa Rica, it disrupts voting. And if you look at, these are some of the new works, since 2015 and 16 onwards, you can imagine, that how in the last just 5-6 years, I call it, not implosion, but explosion of research on analyzing disenfranchisement of migrants around the world, And perhaps we joined the train quite late, but still it's the right time to reflect on this crisis in Turkish municipalities, and also look at United States. In the recent elections, the Trump elections and the post-Trump election. Those who have been following post Biden's election to the presidency, you can see that how blacks, Mexicans, and others are facing the situation of de facto disenfranchisement by different states. I've lived almost a decade there and worked on the ground there. So I can tell you that, there is a very unique Mediterranean design that leads by default to creating this kind of situation where states are creating all kinds of barriers, I call it de facto barriers leading to the exclusion of migrants of various types and kinds from the elections in America. So you can see there is a global template. And but here I'm back here, more in terms of what the title of my talk refers to. What is the theory that I am proposing? If you look at the theory that we are trying to develop, and this is where I benefited a lot from my collaboration with a very multidisciplinary group of researchers engaged with migration research. I really value the social work tradition in migration research. I value the geographers' work in migration research. But the kind of work we are trying to, suggest and argue for is here, the whole idea of underrepresentation, empirically and normatively. So that's important for us. And this is where we are trying to develop a new theory of underrepresentation, linking migrants to various kinds of citizenship rights in democracies. So what we have looked at, Tariq's work, and Orbach's work, our own small work, and Gaikwad and Nelly's recent work. So you can see that there is a very small body of works, but seems like good enough to, build at least a theoretical argument, if not a theory as such, not a theory, because perhaps in the next volume or in the future research, we will come back and try to do more intense and more complex work on explaining normatively and empirically underrepresentation of migrants in politics. So the first, piece of our theoretical framework, or what we call the first explanation, that how does it happen, how the underrepresentation happens in politics, or how the disenfranchisement of migrant happen is here. And you have been hearing, I'm giving you a summary of, tons of literature over the last 30 years, and some of us, those who look at journalistic reports during the elections, in Bengal elections, in Bihar, and UP elections are also coming up. And shortly you will read about, Mumbai migrants, UP migrants returning to UP and participating in elections. But what is here, I'm trying to suggest the first part of our theoretical framework is here, the first explanation, that migrants enduring economic and social ties to their origin regions. This is kind of, maybe in Northeast, Professor Panda will again reflect. Srishtee has worked brilliantly on refugees and migrants. So I hope to hear more, from them to develop this argument. But this argument is quite is mythical, that migrants who live in the cities, migrants in Mumbai, migrants in, say, Bangalore, Chennai, Cochin, and many places, in Punjab, so on and so forth, they maintain enduring economic and social ties to their regions, from where they have come. And they are unwilling to refocus their political activities. If you look at Tariq's work, brilliant work he has done, what he calls, researching Dharavi, slumlords, the second generation of political entrepreneurs in Mumbai. So you will find this is almost has acquired a mythical proportion, that they are unwilling to refocus their political activities. So they continue to remain there, means they are attached to their village. And they continue to maintain clientelistic ties with their local politics. In fact, ethnographers often make that mistakes, that, when they go to the village and when they, work with the migrants in the villages in Bihar, UP, Odisha, Bengal, and the Northeast, they come up with this idea that, migrants maintain these links for also clientelistic ties with local politics. But let me tell you, based on the recent work, there is no little evidence. In fact, I would suggest that if you look at the new works of, Backward and Nellis, they have done very significant work, a large randomized controlled trials in 2 cities of India, Delhi and Lucknow. And this really challenges this whole mythical idea about migrants enduring links with their home and their regions, including clientelistic ties. So this is where, when we looked at the questionnaire, looked at the data, you just look at 98% of eligible respondents said yes, they would like to register locally. And this is where, when we started working with ECI, we pointed out, by analyzing data from almost 26 or 27 states of India, when Election Commission made available, the electoral data to us, and we could sense that, there is this whole idea of voluntary disengagement. So if you look at democracy literature, it thrives, or perhaps it ignores, because of innocence, about, what I call voluntary disengagement. But if you look at the recent studies, large studies, they suggest it's just, there is no evidence for this. Second part of the theory that, what we call political, incorporation, not just exclusion, why migrants are not politically incorporated, in democracies. So we looked at, what is called bureaucratic obstacles. Those who are coming from political science, they know what I'm referring to, the whole idea of bureaucratic capacity, bureaucratic autonomy, and the relationship between a state and society. But what we discovered, that, in the host regions, destination cities, for instance, cities like Mumbai, cities like Bangalore, you will find, there are costs of updating voter registration and navigating electoral bureaucracies. This is here. This is a very critical part of, our theoretical understanding. That often in democracies, and most populous low and middle income democracies, what happens? There is an onus on citizens to initiate enrollment. In fact, I remember, when I moved from the US to Delhi and Delhi to Mumbai, and to get a job here and relocate into Mumbai, to get registered, it involves certain cost, transaction cost. It imposed some cost on me, but I'm a privileged migrant. I'm a professor migrant, so I have friends. I have, good social capital and connections. and that, neutralize the effect of what I call bureaucratic obstacles. So here is the evidence, and again, you look at the works and the studies I've cited. Tariq also suggests the same thing, that we don't provide at-home assistance in completing and submitting voter registration. So look at, once we provide that facility, that bureaucratic facility at home, it improves, registration rates improve. So that's very important, And registration drives, if you look at, globally, and the book is coming out, this is Nicholson book coming, Wind's book coming out, that registration drives, in some cases, be effective tools for spurring enrollment among unregistered citizens. When I use the term unregistered citizens, I actually refer to migrants, disenfranchised. The third part of my puzzle is, and the turnout part, look at, turnout. I guess here I was referring at the outset of my conversation with my colleagues here, Sanjay Kumar and Ashwani Kumar. Here is my colleague Sanjay Kumar, former director of CHTS, and my own student who is now working on a longest analysis and almost like a pioneering work on, election commission in India, Saradip Banerjee at Temple University, or Black and Adam. So here, Sanjay Kumar and Banerjee almost did a demystification, why cities, when you look at turnout rate in cities, why turnout rate in cities is lower? It's not just because of, middle class apathy or rich people's apathy, actually it's a stunning news. And we were really startled, when this study came out and it became really part of our, puzzle, that actually migrants are not registered in the cities. So look at, the story of low turnout and poor turnout in cities is not a fallout of the middle class apathy, but because, there is a poor registration and poor recognition of migrants as citizens in cities. So this is 65% of the recent migrants registered voter rights. So this is kind of. Achil also, 17 in a sample of Delhi construction workers, only 1 in 5 migrants had ever voted in the city's election. And then Bangalore-based, Janagar. So these are some of the interesting parts. Coming back here, I think those who are familiar with, Priya Disinkar's work, and the work of anthropologists, sociologists, Palamaru, laborers, you can find in cities like Bangalore, you will find cities in cities like my city, my home city here in Mumbai. I guess, the estimation, it's a rough estimation, but these Palamaru, a huge number, they have never ever voted, based on micro studies. Again, I'm suggesting these are approximation. But and finally, we come to problem here, which I guess was detected by Myron Wiener, in 78 in his classic work. And interestingly, in 1978, immediately after the publication of Sons of the Soil work, Sons of the Soil work of Myron Wiener, Parliament passed the law, which was almost dysfunctional, Interstate, Workmen Act. So you can see the link, and where we find ostracism and anti-migrant bias by local-born residents and their elite representatives, mainly politicians. Not just in India, but elsewhere in many parts of the world, and especially in the cities, Latin America. In fact, we are proposing a book, a comparative book, looking at Latin America and Africa cities, in terms of the disenfranchised migrants. So this is like, a global story, because the migrants will, you have here, I've been in Mumbai and I've gone through, and seen very closely. In fact, I remember vividly, when MNSA had launched NTUP, NT-Bihari movement on the street, I nearly got lynched, So I remember very vividly what it means to be a migrant in the city, which has become my home now. And I'm for many of my works related to Mumbai. So the common complaints against migrants are following: the heightened labor market competition, strained public services, dilute the ethno-cultural fabric of urban society. So here is the Son of the Soil thesis, which is not as violent as it was in the past, or as predicted by, Myron Wiener, but is still sufficient enough to contribute to disenfranchisement of migrants. So this is you can look at, and I'm trying to analyze two patterns here: passive indifference and active antagonism. So the political apathy or bias can be passive, and that can be also active. Active means then you pass voter suppression measures or violent collective action. Violent collective action by regional parties, and especially sons of the soil parties, nativist party. And here I'm using some data from 2014 World Value Surveys, survey which covered 52 countries. 82% of the native-born citizens report that they always voted or usually voted. So this is where Gaikwad and Nellis used to compare and contrast that. If you look at the turnout rate of native-born citizens and compare and contrast with the migrants, you can see, migrants voting less and natives are voting more. So, yeah. So, in what ways, we need to look at, and we are working with the Election Commission, gave us insight about looking at in the manuals, the official manuals, the instruments of governmentality of, running, managing, controlling elections in India. So if you look at how this exclusion happens here, why political incorporation doesn't happen, because migrant workers are often unknown quantity in local politician eyes, Bombay, Chennai. Of late, I'm hearing from small micro studies of ethnographers and from my colleagues' works that they are becoming relevant in Kerala elections, they are becoming relevant in Chennai elections, But I haven't come across, the good news that the migrant workers have become known quantities for politicians, and they have been incorporated in Tamil Nadu elections, Kerala elections, or AP elections. So that we need to know and need to research. So, and that is where, local politicians are not interested in mobilizing migrants through the registration process. That's something, I guess, we need more civic action supported by Election Commission and the government, including the state governments. Finally, if you look at, the corruption, inertia, and the class factor, we have been talking about, we have looked at, migrants from the class factor, but look at the class bias, you look at the COVID, when they were walking back home, millions of migrant workers, you could see nothing happened, I mean, like there was hardly any support other than, shedding tears for them, that, they, and the tragic, and lamenting on the tragic situation, So I would suggest that inertia, bureaucratic inertia, corruption of various kind, and classism mar India's voter registration system. These are like, these are like epidemic, These viruses are hidden in the Indian democracy, in the inner recesses of Indian democracy. So, and look at, Pesakishinkin's report study, the median processing time for new voter registration to be 150 days for middle class residents, and just imagine 331 days for the city's slum residents. So now you can see how disenfranchisement happens here. Perhaps, in one of my pieces refer to invisibility, and through, passive and active forms of hostility. And there are other, you can see what I call Leviathan labyrinth, on a lighter note. So if you look at, the complex, registration process, I'm sure we have another meeting coming up in the Election Commission next week. And perhaps, I must give credit to the Election Commission. Despite the bureaucratic challenges, humongous task of, identifying, we don't have as yet any national survey of migrant voters. We had proposed a couple of years back to the commission. The commission is still considering it. Once that happens, we would be able to identify, and then we could measure the impact of, disenfranchisement of migrant voters on various forms of democratic deepening in the country. So form filling, right from the form filling, you can see, and if you have lived with the migrants, you have done ethnographic, research with the migrant, you can see what I'm trying to say, that it's very hard for a migrant, form filling, documentation, documentation. Professor Panda and we have worked on Narega, and we have been quite familiar with the documentation crisis or the tragedy of document. And there are so many documents before you want to get a ordinary work in NRCA, you have to fill so many documents. Now things have become easier with the use of technology, submission, verification, and local BLO, booth level officers. And this is where Tariq's work, Orwak's work, and Gaikwad and Nelly's works are significant, because they went to that level through their randomized control experiments, qualitative studies, and they found out that the bias and apathy is writ large at the BLO level. Finally, and most cases, when the migrant voters on migrants' applications are rejected, they are not informed. This we have discovered from this. Globally, you know that many countries around the world have been putting in place mechanisms like absent voting, early voting, voting by proxy, postal voting, electronic voting, mobile polling. I mean, like Election Commission has been doing a fantastic work, I'm not saying that they haven't done the work, but still much needs to be done. And I would come back and I tell you that based on our study, the Commission took a call in terms of developing portability of the ballot. What I'm sure will happen, that the project has been given to Madras IIT and they are developing, the prototype is ready. And perhaps in some districts shortly in the next parliamentary election, that will be used, portability of the ballot, ensuring that if you are resident, ordinary resident, anywhere in the country, if you're moving anywhere in the country, you can vote from there. So the good things are happening, but at the same time, newer forms of discrimination, newer forms of disenfranchisement have also come worldwide, So that's what I refer to post-Trump elections and how American states are trying to put more barrier. Portability, I just mentioned. Now, finally, that's my final slide. Way forward for migrants, political incorporation. With the term, political incorporation is significant theoretically and also empirically, because if you look at, migrants as a category of citizens in democracy, is very significant to theorize this idea of political incorporation, to address the issue of democratic deficit. Citizen action is important. But my sense is that it is not sufficient enough to bring about full political incorporation. The reason is because we need the support of political elites. If you just look at, there is a brilliant chapter by a leading eminent political scientist, Sridharan, who has been theorizing on political parties and migrants, looking at, and is creating a typologies of parties in India and how do they respond to disenfranchisement of migrants. It's very important that political elites need to reconsider, this idea of political incorporation and election officers in general. Two, as I suggested, the registration drive by election officer. Three, voting migrants are more likely to consider the seat there. This is also, new generation of studies. We are looking at, Shashard, brilliant study of 2018 in Mumbai, because, and Tariq Thatcher's own work, because the migrants increasingly started considering the city there. And they also harbor norms of inter-ethnic tolerance. This is another implication that I'm not talking today, but in our larger work, I will come back to, the larger issue of violence, riots, and communal discord in the country. And this is very relevant for Northeast, and especially Assam, where I would like, Professor Panda and Srishtee to reflect on. Inter-ethnic tolerance, and this is my response to my good friend and celebrated political scientist Ashutosh Varna's classic work on ethnicity and riot in India. The bonding part, the bridging and the bonding part of what Robert Putnam calls social capital. Finally, sons of the soil challenges remain. Amela, there is where we are trying to do in our work, revising, modifying the great work and the great thesis of Myron Wiener. And they can be altered into a less violent forms of nativist reaction, like reservation for natives in the local employment. You have just seen what's happening in Andhra, Haryana, and there are legal challenges. De facto and de jure. So I stop here. Hope to see. Wait a second. How to stop? How to? Okay. Now,
Thank you so much, Professor Ashwani Kumar, for
but
this
just tell me
insightful
how to
lecture.
stop the sharing.
Sir, just stop the share.
Acha, acha.
Stop share. Yes, done.
Just
Okay.
a second.
So your video got off.
Wait a second. Yeah, done.
Okay.
I'm out, I guess.
Yes, sir. It's fine.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Okay, Ritika.
Thank you so much, Professor Ashwani Kumar, for this insightful lecture and for putting so much of energy together to create this lecture. Now, without any further ado, I would like to invite our discussants. I invite Professor Bhagirathi Panda to put forth your views. Over, sir.
Thank you so much. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, Dr. Arjun and the whole team of IMPRI and my fellow panelists who are here itself. It was wonderful to listen, Professor Ashwani Kumar, always, and today is no exception. And he has very brilliantly brought out the issue of migrants, internal migrants, and I think has put it, the whole issue of this migrants, he has put it in a very, very appropriate framework of development and the necessity of including them. His analysis of the migrants and their, I think, exclusion from the entitlements with respect to citizenship, I think very brilliantly done, wonderfully done. And he has also given very explicitly the reasons for this kind of a situation to be there itself. I'm sorry, actually my battery, I don't know, I'm not connected the connector. Let me just
Please connect. Yes, yes.
sorry for the, I think I totally forgot it. Sorry for the, apology for this interruption. So when I heard him, when he was presenting, I think the magnitude, he very poignantly brought out the magnitude of exclusion with respect to the migrants and then their flight. But subsequently, I was more impressed with the kind of solutions that he has given and the reasons that he has found. For example, the element of transaction cost, bureaucracy, and all those things which he has described. I think I fully buy that logic that many times basically it's because of the huge transaction cost that the migrants they encounter in the city space, and that demotivates them to go for registration. I think avail some of the entitlements of being a citizen in the city. So that's there. And then his suggestions, particularly the son of the soil theory, which he has very prominently, explained here. That's a fact, actually. In fact, in the Indian system, Indian polity, an Indian state, that's a reality. But he has given some suggestions how can we calibrate that in terms of at least ensuring some kind of employment and entitlements, some specific entitlements for the natives, and in the process, I think the migrants maybe can be, they can be entrepreneurs. Maybe they may not be availing certain kind of entitlements that natives are entitled to. Some kind of calibration, which also he has suggested. I think I'm quite impressed. It was very enlightening to get his very concept of migration, internal migration, the magnitude, and then the reasons for such kind of an exclusion, and the way out in terms of how to make them inclusive in the process of our nation building and development in terms of giving a lot of solutions. Now, in the course of this discussion, Professor Kumar also, I think, has given. I think he has taken the Northeast example many times. So one is, the issue of is internal migration and their exclusion from, from the entitlements of citizenry. In the Northeast is a little complex. I think complex basically because although there are, it's not totally an exception. There are forces which lead to this kind of exclusion in other parts of the country are also applicable here. But then there is much more than to it. For example, this very insider-outsider things are everywhere, and also it's here in the North. And then this conflict between tradition and the modern process of development there, and it's also much more evident here itself. But what makes the Northeast little different is that land in the in the context of the Northeast, access to land has been the most important asset or possession with respect to the people here. The evidence suggests, data suggests, right now almost like 76% of the locals, particularly in the rural areas, they have become landless in the Northeast. And the forces of modernization moving to in terms of acquiring other kinds of assets, maybe in financial and etc. It hasn't become that endemic in the Northeast. And space is a constraint here. Land is a constraint here. That's why I think people, natives, they would always see the outsiders, I think maybe compromising or taking away their land, or maybe compromising with their culture, maybe, and then that cultural dimension also comes to play a role. And they have also seen the kind of things which has happened, the marginalization of the natives in places like, in states like Tripura, or even what's happening in Assam. So that, and these are the, these are cases actually, and in a very recent history they have all happened. So that many times make them insecure, natives. So that's so that the Northeast situation in that way is a little different. And more than that, what has happened actually, some kind of vested interests also have come in terms of, I think, monopolizing and capturing the ethnic identity in a sense actually, and then giving an impression to the natives, to the common people in the Northeast, they have the agency through which many of the things can. They have the agency, like the pressure groups, the student bodies. So many times they act, they feel, I know the common people feel that okay, they are the agency, and through them they can realize many of their, I think, whatever developmental objectives they do have. And many times these pressure groups, because they all see in their pursuit to capture political power or maybe social power. So they often resort to, they often magnify and create hype, and then try to accentuate this insider outsider, kind of situation, insider outsider kind of a situation there. So that's where the Northeast is a little different. Having said about the Northeast, let me also, I think, for Professor Ashwani Kumar has, I think he has explained it, but then let me put it in the developmental perspective, the very practice and the very practice and theory of exclusion of the migrants. It has its origin in some kind of development theory, which is basically centers around the development of the informal sector. For a pretty long time in developing countries, and more so in countries like India, we started buying this Western theory and subsequently the practice that followed up, that informal sector in the Indian, in these countries, they're very transitory. In fact, initially when it came up, they said, no, it's coming up. Initially, they said there can't be any informal sector. We know Lewis theory and many other theories. But subsequently, when the informal sector, particularly in the urban space, when it started manifesting, then the frontline economists, they say, this would wither away, it's transitory and all that. That hasn't happened. And right now, more than 65%, 70% of the workers, the people who are working in the urban space, they're in the informal sector. And unfortunately, we in India and some other developing countries, we buy that kind of a argument of this Western economist, and in our policy prescriptions, we never thought that the informal can be an important sector promoting, I think, economic development. So that's why if you see our policy prescriptions, interventions with respect to the informal sector, we didn't have anything. We had everything for the formal sector, for the large scale sector, for the small scale sector in the industrial space, but then for the informal sector, we didn't have. So that policy bias, and then that policy, since that policy bias continued and even still prevails, and the migrants are also tied up with that. Most of the migrants which come to the city, they are in fact they work in the informal sector. They make a living in the informal sector. So when I analyze Professor Kumar's findings, arguments, I just want to put it in this perspective also, that the migrants, they have been excluded from the development practice and the story of India's development, essentially because we had a fundamental policy bias by ignoring the informal sector's role in economic development. That's one thing I think we can reflect upon it, and I think that's one of the reasons why the migrants are, excluded. And this necessitates, I think I can sum it up in my own way, language. But as we talk about cultural nationalism today, and through that we want to develop the country or whatever we call it, it's time that we also think in terms of a migrant nationalism, which we call actually the internal migrant nationalism. And that will in fact actually put the whole issue of migrants and their exclusion from many of the benefits of citizenry, I think, in a developmental, holistic developmental. I think for the time, let me stop here itself. Let me hear our other eminent panelists. I think more actually subsequently, if there is time, we can discuss. So thank you so much, Professor Ashwani Kumar, for enlightening us on this very subject. And in fact, actually bringing the whole issue of the migrants and their, in fact, the Indian story of development, I think in the 21st century can never be complete without in fact ensuring and giving that entitlement to the migrants. I think as from an economic point of view, as an economist perspective, I think unless if you want to increase the, the market, if you want to increase the size of the market and the demand, I think, you need to empower, you need to provide that kind of welfare entitlements which the migrants are supposed to get, they're entitled to get. Unless you provide that, I think our consumption basket will always be suboptimal and will be, I think, distorted. So that's why I think thanks a lot, Professor Ashwani Kumar, for enlightening us and bringing this issue of the migrants and their political disenfranchisement in development space. I'll stop here itself and let me hear my other eminent panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Next, we move on to Dr. Arvind Pandey.
Good evening to all. And first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Arjun for inviting me, for just not only listening this fascinating lecture, we always admire about Professor Ashwani, that whenever I listen, since my MPhil days when I was doing my MPhil on migrant workers itself in JNU, since those days I remember that every time when we listen, we think that whatever we have read, we have to redo. So some new things which emerge. So I start from his points itself, which he has highlighted, that invisibility of the migrant, which is very pertinent issue. Why they are invisible in the urban space? I start from this question itself. So if you see the delineation of our ward boundaries, so, and the census definition and the NSS definition, how we define particular settlements. And if you see as we know that migrant are very heterogeneous group, it's not the homogeneous group. So even if in that sense, if I locate migrant, those who are in the slum area, they are also as vulnerable, because they are somehow, you can say, the long-term circular migrant, or at least you can say semi-permanent migrant. But even for slum migrant itself, if we go through the definition of Census of India, only those settlements which have 70 to 80 households comprising 400 to at least 300, 400 members, that are recognized by the census as a slum. Okay, and then comes to the NSS definition, which is not used by any particular agency in India, which recognize any slum settlements or any settlements which has at least 20 households, which is much. If you comprise 20 households, so at least we can cover those migrants or those slum migrants which are settled nearby railway lines or nearby drainage. So at least we can count them, but the invisibility is there because largely the agencies avoid to count or even acknowledge that they exist in the city. Okay, so this is the first major issue. But if you just go through the work of Tachil or Adam works, so there they have basically, through the ethnographic survey, once they have highlighted that how the second generational migrants, especially, they are asserting at least their political rights in the city. So there you can easily find through these new studies which are emerging, that once the density of the slum increases, the number of households increases in a particular slum area, then what happens? And one important point which I am highlighting from the Adams writing, that if you just go through and survey any particular slum area in India, you will not find the parachuting of any local political leader. It's always the migrant worker who are maybe second generation, but living in that area itself is the leader, local leader, maybe from different parties. So the issue here is that once you are not acknowledged, so majority of the time, the short-term migrant or the seasonal migrants who live on construction sites or any particular settlements, which even does these settlements, even the local authority do not acknowledge that they exist. So how you can ensure that they will be counted as a voter, or they will be counted in any electoral voter list? So that is the one major challenge which one could highlight, and which is the failure of urban planning and bureaucrats also. Second very important point is here that as we can see that largely over the time of period, the migrant, especially the second generational migrant, they are asserting their political rights through their local leader at least, because see, this is the only way. They cannot wait to claim the entitlements, the basic amenities, the very basic human things which one could be easily provided. We have passed the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and several other declaration India is signatory with. And we have a long history of urban development programs. But if you see the inclusion of slum dwellers, largely which comprised with the migrant workers itself, so you will find that largely for a long duration, when I was reviewing some of my work for social protection of urban migrant, I was amazed to see that till the JNURM, there was no list of settlements, slum settlements for any of the urban local bodies in India. So if that is the case, how one can ensure that you will be having the electoral voter list, which is the first prerequisite for having the adult franchisee. So this is one very important issue, that until unless the registration of each and every workers is happening, and the implementation of Interstate Migrant Workmen Act also, through that the establishment, the contractor has to take the responsibility of providing all sorts of housing facilities. So once that housing facility is established, one can easily claim their entitlements, including the political entitlements also. But that is not happening. Again and again, we are saying that this is not the first time we are saying, from National Commission of Rural Labor, then Second National Commission of Labor, then NCUS report. If you just go through in every single committees which was formed by the government itself, when it comes to the adaptation of the recommendation provided by these different committees, either it is not accepted or it is very partially accepted. So, thankfully, in the recent work of political scientists, especially political scientists, because largely, if I would say, unfortunately, majority of the work in India, especially on migration studies, are based on the secondary data source, and it's a mostly armchair researchers. They seldom go to the field, collect the kind of data which Professor Kumar used to gather, collect the data, and then come out with the nuances of that, why this is happening, why this kind of you can say the invisibility which prevails in most of the metropolitan cities, especially for the migrant workers. So fortunately, in current study, if I would highlight that, like previously I have already highlighted, that how that now, especially the second generational migrant, those who are not the short-term seasonal migrant, because they are still vulnerable, they are still, they do not get the chance to basically participate in any election process, but largely the long-term circular or seasonal migrants who live in slum area, and especially the slum area which are larger, through some or other means to claim their entitlement in the city spaces, they are through their local leaders, they are engaging themselves in these kind of political activity, but there are limitations, because as you can see that the ladder through which they can go to the upper ladder of the politics is very limited. Largely, they can go up to the ward council or ward member. So that is one limitation, because of which there is no interest also, even in the second generational migrant. Because see, they also know that there is a limitation, even in their entire political life, they will not be able to get the seat or chance to become, or even if they actively work for a certain political party, they will not get the chance to go for the higher level or higher ladder of the political party. So that is one limitation, because of which they generally want to root themselves in their native places also, because they also know that at least the family is there. Sometimes their left behind families are living there, and largely their entitlements at their native place also dependent on the kind of their political interest or to whom they are voting. So that is one reason because of which you can see that that even in this COVID period, during election times, there was ferry outside the railway station, in every single railway station of UP, you will easily find that the local leaders have organized the some kind of mode of transportation so that they can get the vote from these migrant workers who are living in different metropolitan cities. So I think the most of the points which Professor Ashwani has highlighted, I agree with that. And thank you for highlighting these things, because these things generally does not come with the account which is provided by any demographer, or sometimes as economists we miss these points also, because largely we don't see these different dimensions through those angles which are easily available with a political scientist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now we move on to Dr. Srishtee Sethi.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you, Dr. Kumar, for inviting us as panelists, and Professor Ashwani Kumar for enlightening us today with this very potent and well-researched conversation, which I have had the privilege of being privy to slightly over previous conversations, sir. I'd like to mention what Professor Kumar has on previous occasions kind of highlighted, that knowledge production isn't just important, it is also important to translate that knowledge into more policy frames and the everyday, so that the changes that we are hoping to achieve are visible in the everyday. And I believe this research is an exemplary instant of that. Especially since has been engaging in this for decades and inspiring, early career researchers like us to kind of highlight key aspects of disenfranchisement of the migrant. I believe it is very, very important to understand, again, taking some of those quotes from Sir's actual lecture, is we need to reimagine our migrants as citizens. I think this is something that I'd like to underline again. Whether we have fallen again into that space of categorizing them into good or bad, full or half, especially within both theory and praxis. So we see oftentimes that we look at them as full citizens, half citizens, non-citizens, and thereby access to services gets reduced, whether you're in the hinterland or the borderland. Another important aspect of Sir's talk was the paradoxes of migration that he touched upon in the initial part, which may include various facets of internal migration, which encompasses gender, ethnicity, caste, class, particularly, as Sir highlighted towards the end, electoral participation, the struggle for settlement, as well as this politics of displacement. So at the core of it, are we really imagining these issues on a more everyday basis, and a challenge where we do not see migrants as fully ours yet? So are these new categories that we are creating privileging certain migrants and disprivileging others, thereby keeping them outside of the realm? Again, with the biases of caste and class that we see oftentimes. What did COVID do? I think very interestingly put the gaze back on the migrant. We knew there were patterns of mobility and migration that were happening, but COVID really highlighted the plea and highlighted just how much the migrant contributes to a city and the processes of city making. And I think, therefore, it is important that we highlight and understand this deficit of democracy that COVID and frames of policy intervention after COVID pointed towards. It's not just the deficit of democracy, but also citizenship. So it is almost, one can say that we are enhancing or enabling citizenship with the passing of acts such as the CAA, but fundamentally, with our own internal migrants, we're unable to recognize and identify some of these spaces, which may, again, vis-a-vis migrants internally, keep them at the fringes. Just to also move a little bit towards, the chapter contribution in Sir's eminent book that he was discussing, Mobility and Migration, Newer Forms of Citizenship. The question of borderlands really strikes in this conversation, where Sir had highlighted the local elites, the political elites, the natives as well. So there is definitely, as one understands, a triangle of power that is at play. I think one has to recognize this locally and then at the state level, where we see citizens, for example, at the border, who are born residents, local elites, as well as the state officials. So the migrants, whether they cross the border and enter the country or whether they're internally mobilized, they remain outside this triangle permanently, and therefore they need a specific kind of assistance. Another crucial point was, close links that they maintain with the home village. Now, this home village can be in another part of the same country or across the border, which is again highlighted in the chapter. But I think we need to now emphasize on the clientelistic ties that they have with the state or the district they've moved into, and therefore the importance of data, of quantitative analysis at the district level, which Professor Kumar highlighted time and again during his talk. I think it's crucial also to recognize migrants as full citizens of our country. Just because they leave the home village and arrive into bigger cities or smaller towns, for example, I think it's important and crucial to explore that travel and journey that they make and purposes. And here I'd like to mention another project that Professor Kumar had guided us with in Chatra, the Aspirational District Project, where we saw a huge amount of the youth had moved out of the country and incidentally moved out of the district and moved to Bombay, for example. Most of the waiters in the local area in Bombay were from Chatra and villages and blocks in and around the district. As well as their interplay. So what are the issues that they face when they return back home? They are willing to return back home, but what are the challenges that they consistently face? One being definitely of an active democratic engagement at the city that they arrive into, which is again very effectively evidenced in the northeastern region. So I suppose there is a deliberate intention here to mention areas at the borders, both the northeast, which is the eastern frontier, as well as the western frontier. We see often enough this being quoted in the lower houses of the parliament, where migrants have crossed the borders, and once they have done so, the disenfranchisement as well as lack of services are like any other internal migrant. So the number of years elapsed after they have entered the region or the country, they become internally mobilized and migrated community groups, which again fall prey to the processes of bureaucracy, unfortunately. Again, I feel this is a question harping back to the idea of the city. Are we trying to, do this in a more strategic manner or in a more systemic manner? And I'd like to, submit very humbly how this should, the water procurement with local MLAs, because some of them at the borderland, for example, Jodhpur, they are able to identify these internally, internal migrants and provide voter IDs. So can we move away from the strategic incorporation and into a more systemic incorporation of locating the migrant and providing them the services and assistance that they truly do require to be part of the democratic engagement of our country? Because as again mentioned, migrants are actively contributing to city making processes. And with that, I also wanted to mention Kagler and Schiller, who had done a global study in Germany, US, and Turkey, where they highlight through cultural and anthropological insights on who is really being emplaced. So the emplacement of a migrant into the city making process is extremely important and to be recognized, again, not strategically by a handful of local MLAs who may have the power and strength, but in a more systemic fashion by the ECI. And at some point understand these interconnected trajectories between cities too, because according to Kagler and Schiller, they've argued that each city has a question and answer role, and they contribute to each other's history making and place making at some level or another. So we cannot ignore the fact that if there is a Bihari migrant going to Kerala, it is also forming a pattern of migration, which needs to be deliberated upon and systematized to assist them economically and socially with specific governmental schemes and processes. And finally, I think stepping away from the identity conflict issue, which may at some point address the sons of soil, dilemma almost, if one can mention, and focusing on the belongingness, I believe, and the idea of home for the migrants may enhance our understandings of their inclinations and processes, thereby removing this big hurdle of, not being able to participate in the democratic rights within the country. And I would like to sort of hear on, the other panelists that are available. But happy to talk about it a little bit more if we have more time towards the end.
Thank you, ma'am. Ashwani sir, would you like to respond to any of the queries?
I enjoyed the comments, comments of each one of you, and grateful to your, deeper reflection on some of the issues that I have discussed in my presentation. And I've benefited hugely from all of you, your presentations and your own discussion. And thank you, Professor Panda. I guess you are absolutely right. And I look forward to your work, because today it seems you have coined a new phrase for us, migrants nationalism. Let's see the interplay between migrant nationalism and cultural nationalism. And certainly it's coming from a very veteran, renowned development economist. So it has, this whole twist of, cultural, anthropological, political, shifts. I look forward to that brilliantly. And Arvind, that's very fantastic. I'm happy that you guys are engaged with, migration studies. We look forward to a whole new generation of scholars and imbued with new theoretical perspectives, and just addressing to all of you together, including Srishtee, who has been doing this work for almost a decade, and always inspiring us, always coming from the field back, give us an insight. My humbly, my sense is here, my luck was good, because I'm trained here and back in the US, leading, scholars. But, when I came, 30 years down the line, the great Kothari, my teacher, mentor, and the great Ashish Nandi, who, the reason that I got into slums, the reason I got interested into slum, not came from, neither from, demographer, not geographer, in my accidental 3-decadal relationship with Ashish Nandi, who wrote famously on, he used to tell me that rather than reading books, watch films. I mean, like films like Daman, films like, so I've mentioned in my epilogue, in the book, where referring to literature, referring to, films. And this is where I would like my, young generation scholars to focus on, there's so much insight available there. So back here, there is a, I would not say, but there is a crisis. Even look at, Rajni Kothari's great work, Politics in India, seminal, this is like Bible for everyone. There's no reference to migrants. The book was published in 71. And I had my conversation in the 80s and the 90s, even last year, nothing, politics and people, the whole outburst of civil society. But you look at, where is the migrant? So there is what I'm saying, that as Srishtee has always been telling me to, work more on invisibility of, migrants also occurring in the sense of a knowledge production. Even if you go back to, unfortunately, I never studied directly with Professor Rawls. When I landed up, things were different. But what I've learned, from the leading philosophers, in fact, in the whole, well of ignorance, it seems like we put on a well of ignorance. And going back to Aristotle and Plato, if you learn, the city has always been exclusive space, always been exclusive. Aristotle infamously barred cities for certain categories of people. Slaves not allowed, women stay at home. You can't vote, So what I'm referring again and again through my small little work, hopefully it could be helpful for new generation of studies. But there is a crisis. There is crisis not just in democratic political theory, but also in welfare economics, also in the development economics. What they have done. In fact, you just look at the whole body of works of Sain. I mean, like, you will never find, Sen directly approaching the migrants around the world. It's not a crisis here. It's crisis all over, cities all over the world facing, the first generation migrants all over not voting. Many of them, percentage is very high. But welfare economics did a wonderful work on, enhancing the well-being of the people without recognizing the fact that citizenship rights are essential. What I'm trying to do here, humbly, that I'm positing that welfare rights would be realized only when you realize citizenship rights. And if you study welfare rights in isolation, so welfare economics has been studying, rights of the people, rights of the poor in isolation. I've worked almost 10 years on, many welfare schemes of the country, inside and outside of the government. And I never noticed that, there is, I'm going to raise this issue. I guess in last year, I wrote a piece for Times of India where I raised this issue, directly this issue. That why in NRGA is still not becoming a primary instrument of, not just livelihood, but also realization of citizenship rights for migrant workers. So just go back to the instrumentality of the welfare positions, welfare rights here. Good news that after the COVID crisis, there is now, one nation, one ration card. But one nation, one ration card is good. But why not one nation and one voter? And this is where Election Commission used TISS and where we recommended and where this whole idea of portability, I tell you, when we were working on portability, Srishtee was part of the whole, engagement and the process. We faced, a battle between no changers and pro changers in the establishment, in the larger Indian bureaucracy. Because most of the bureaucratic, design was very clear that there is a barrier. Does it exist? Just go back to the Constituent Assembly. Nobody debated about it. Although the mass exodus happened, almost 75 years down the line, the next mass exodus happened, and then we realized that there is some deficit in the foundation. You're talking about free mobility. You're talking about freely residing, but the states have been doing it, various discrimination and exclusion based on domicility, domicility. There is still no definite authoritative judgment by Supreme Court saying that it cannot be done. So there is a problem here, and we need to recognize this problem. And to sum up this, I don't want to extend and tire all of you, because this is an evolving work, and I always appeal to younger generation, inspiring us, like a 23-year-old Amartya Sen who inspired, Pigu and others, to change their perspective on the world. So I would be very happy to see more works coming out linking both welfare rights and citizenship rights. So when you look at, this is where my response to Partha Chatterjee, but what has happened in the discipline cutting across, that we have looked at migrants as population. We documented them. We did research on them. Even we went to them and did ethnographic studies. We surveyed them, but we never ever considered them as citizens. So my thesis is close to Amartya Sen's thesis. Missing migrants like missing women. And Srishtee was absolutely, beautifully summed up. This whole idea of intersectionality. So, like again, going back to Myron Wiener's, distrust of Indian elite. Myron Wiener was notorious for pointing out why children work here in India, why they don't work elsewhere. Because of the, elite bias. You want them to work. And this is Myron's another classic work, Child and the State in India. So somehow, I'm looking at, the deeper crisis within the system of the state, and democratic crisis. Finally, Arjun, I would like to sum up that indeed, time has come. Time has come when we need to look at, I'm very fond of Derrida, and somehow, he is not read in the migration studies and not very popular philosopher in migration studies. But what I learned from Derrida, that hospitality. What is hospitality? Hospitality originates from hostility. And I'm good that, Arvind reminded me about second generation and third generation, migrants in cities like, older cities like Mumbai, the cosmopolitan cities. The good news that the second generation, migrants have become domiciled and they have become entrepreneurs on their own. But as Sridharan has been working, fleshing out, a party system and the migrants, we need more studies because, and we need to see that why second generation migrants, what we call and Thachil or we call them political entrepreneurs. Why political entrepreneurs have not succeeded to the extent we would imagine in reversing this trend of political exclusion in the country. I'm on the ground, speaking from the ground, interacting with them, looking at the registration, looking at the electoral cards. And I still find that many of them say that, no, I will go to UP and vote there. I will not vote here. So that's something we need to keep in mind. And I would stop here that hostility and hospitality are part of the same person. Migrants anywhere in the world bound to provoke some hostility, but that hostility, if you look at in a Kotharian framework, can be converted into hospitality. This hospitality is used in Spain, what they call conviviality. Conviviality, it will become a new political mode of conviviality and help democracy to become far more richer and far more inclusive. But the bad news is here, on which I want to stop, that around the world, there is democratic backsliding. So in Turkey, in Budapest, in Hungary, I've traveled before COVID, many major cities of the world. And because of the backsliding, because of the authoritarianism, because of the populism, recently Ashutosh Varshney has edited a wonderful book on populism. We are now facing this situation of democratic backsliding. So despite the COVID and when the new normals returns or the old normals comes back, we will be wondering about the whole possibility of redressing the issue of invisibility and disenfranchisement of the migrant. So in democracy, and if you just imagine, I stop here. Imagine, 20 crore people not voting. Imagine, what kind of democracy we are going to have back home. So it is like Tagore's Ghare and Bahare. I did enjoy this profound discussion, very interesting discussion, benefited hugely from discussion, and thank Arjun and entire IMPRI team. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. And let me also quickly put forth all the questions together so that we can also.
अच्छा question भी बच गया है.
सर उसको way forward में we can एक साथ combine कर लेंगे so that all the participants can get time. So I'll first come to Facebook Live. Devendra Panini ji is saying that good evening to all the eminent panelists. It is really an honor to have witnessed such an august discussion. I'm really thankful for Bhagirathi Panda sir. That's only comments and thank you. Same for Sandhya Rani ma'am. No such questions as such. I'll be brief. Two questions Sandhya Iyer ma'am has asked. One is about how can we, if we can move towards one nation, one ration, what are the possibilities of ensuring one nation, one voter card? What the possibilities, what are the challenges? I think also a regional question ma'am is really highlighting. And sir was touching upon it. And another question ma'am has asked that migrants are seen as have-nots when urban development plans are drawn. It makes it convenient to policymakers to keep that identity on given limited resources, spaces, and more importantly, political will for a redistributive ethos. Also, the space question Arvind sir was highlighting very much.
Arjun, can I come in, quickly, just for 60-second or 50-second bite?
Okay, sir. Okay.
The first is, and this is like, Election Commission has gone on record and it has appeared, there was a bill pending, but 2019 Parliament lapsed. The bill could not be implemented, NRI voting rights. We have worked on NRI. Again, this is a major test work, we will led, Srishtee is aware, we designed portal, everything. So one nation, one voter, the project has been given to Madras IIT. They're working on portability of voter. So if you are a migrant and if you are in Manipur, you can vote from there. That's almost like a revolution, almost a revolution. And two, about about this what is called the question of redistributive, something like Arvind said about it. The second part of the question.
Yes, that in urban development plans, when it is drawn, migrants are seen as have-nots.
No, my sense is there is a one, there is a disciplinary bias here. Because if you look at, I'm not reflecting, I'm not a trained geographer, I'm not an urban planner, but where I'm trained, I would speak from there. My sense is, as I referred to Aristotle, Plato, city planning has always been exclusionary. Always, this is where my development economics friend, I mean, like Professor Panda raised the issue of migrant nationalism. In fact, if you look at global literature on immigration, migrants have become a nation by themselves. In many parts of the world, invisibility because they live in their own camps. So my sense is, urban planners need to look at migrants, not just have not, because have not is a Marxist phrase coming from a structuralist perspective. But the new scholarship, if we look at the new younger generation scholarship, have broadened that. So they are looking more migrant as Mirza Gopal's classic work on citizenship. If you don't look at, if you just look at have and have nots, that's going to affect your entire thinking about, migrants incorporation in the city. You only look at, a spatial incorporation. You give them a slum and tell them that, look, you are there. You give them some social protection scheme. You give them that, look, you settle there. This is where, we have to look at the larger land scope of, voting is not in a small act, Arjun. Voting is a much larger act, encompassing normative aspect of democracy and also procedural aspect of citizenship. This is where I would stop. So there is certainly, we need to re-theorize about urban planning from a more, as Arvind also referred to, and we are all aware that migrants are not a monolith. No? Migrants are many, of many types. So short-term migrants always slip out of your hand. And there are about 120 to 150 million. This is not my estimation. This is Priya Disenfranchised estimation, one of the leading authorities on migration literature. So this is where, I think development economists, urban planners and the bureaucrats, need to learn.
Right. And so very aptly, the title of today's deliberation was From Theory to Evidence. And when we come to the evidence part, especially in the last 1-2 years, especially the Corona times, government has taken a lot of, steps. Also, we also released the report of minimum wage, and but that was not accepted. How do you see that as a lever can work? We had something called PM Swanidhi for the street vendor that was very much highlighted, and some 10,000 rupees loans has been given to almost 6-7 million street vendors. Then we also have Pradhan Mantri Atmanirbhar Rozgar Yojana for less than 15,000 or so. We are also giving some support of PF and others. Then we have affordable rental housing complexes that was highlighted last year very much. Then, one ration, one voter. Then there were many migrant registries. Now we are doing some surveys, and we also have skill registry. Many of those things were also coming. And how do you see some cash transfer were also given from Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana? 500. Many state government also give to auto wala, and many such things were coming. How do you see the role of universal basic income or minimum wages also aligned with the voter rights as you're highlighting? Because that has become a norm now. Because in each voter's day, EC comes with a function and then says that we have given this much of voter ID card to migrant or homeless. That is happening. In crux, I will ask that the approach really, as you have been also highlighting, has been ad hoc towards the migrant. Even so much of time has passed, and recently we have also seen, be it the overall employment issues and so many other things also are there. But how do you see uh, the role, this ad hoc approach taking place, and how to overcome this for all the governments, especially central government, and what will be the role of state government and especially the cities, because cities do accommodate them. So there are also regional differences. We hear a lot of good practices from southern states that they are welcoming. Some very bad news also from Surat or all the other places that also keep on coming. So how do you see all these things happening? And what do you think that how do we change the perception of migration. You really were mentioning about Europe, America, US especially. They see migration more from the opportunity point of view. How do you see in India that will change over time? I think each of the panelists can take this. There are also many act and other related things. So how do you see to that? Shall we go to our discussion first and then come to Ashwani sir for his concluding remarks also? Ashwani sir?
I guess I would like to hear more now. This is my second talk in another.
Professor Panda, over to you. Also incorporate.
I love listening, you know.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir. In fact, actually, one thing I forgot while I was discussing, I think Professor Kumar's presentation. I think very poignantly has brought out the process analysis of exclusion of migrants. Political, of course, going beyond political. I don't think actually anyone has done such kind of an intense, in-depth process analysis. Many of the situational analysis have been done. I'm so happy that actually he has done this process analysis, and this needs to be taken further in terms of linking it up, as I said, with the macro development bias that we have towards the informal sector, because organically migration, internal migration, even seasonal migration also is linked up with informal sector and its contribution to Indian economy. And consistently, I think we have been neglected the informal sector in our policy practice. But that needs to be, I think, all these measures which Dr. Arjun was narrating, and which Professor Kumar has rightly said, this is all ad hoc regime. I still consider that these are all piecemeal ad hoc measures. Of course, they have their own kind of, I'm saying maybe they're based on some kind of political overtones and all that. They are all welcome. But ultimately, it means that you need to structurally have some kind of measures, taken, so that on its own, I think migrants, they get back their position, their rights, their entitlements, and then truly they become Atmanirbhar migrants. We need to make it as this is in currency that we need to have Atmanirbhar Bharat. So Atmanirbhar Bharat also requires Atmanirbhar migrant. And how do we make this migrant Atmanirbhar? It can't be just done by simply giving some temporary kind of facilities here and there. It needs to be organically built upon and practiced. That's what I feel. And the second thing, actually, I think Professor Kumar's book again brings back the question of and the imperative of mainstreaming migration and their remittances in the development theory and practice. Many often, actually, when we analyze the migrants and their role in development, I think it's, as Arjun has said, in developed countries, they all take it as an opportunity. But we always find it as something else. It's an obstruction kind of a thing. So we need to, I think, build upon our new story of development, in the premise and the practice of mainstreaming migration and mainstreaming migrants, and acknowledging and in fact quantifying the remittances that they send to their people, I think, in different places. So I think from my side, ultimately, I think what I wanted to share with all of you, that we need to, I think, overcome the policy, the bias that we have in our macro development policy. And without actually understanding or bringing in the organic relationship between the formal sector and the informal sector. We have never done it, and that needs to be done. And when that's done, I think to a great extent, we can understand, explain, and realize the importance of the migration in the development practice. And that's what I think states like Karnataka are able to understand now. I think many other states are unable to understand now. So let me stop here itself. That's what actually I wanted to say.
Right, right. So let me go to Dr. Pandey and Arvind sir. 2-3 more questions have come, and largely pertaining to what you have worked with Professor Devulina ma'am. It's really on women, children, and the younger migrants. Also, how do we see those migrants to the overall urban planning? If you can also take those, Arvind sir.
Yeah, so basically, see, the first point, which again I'm reiterating, so the acknowledgement of the existence of migrant in city. That is the first stage to acknowledge that they are also the citizen. They are not the second-class citizen in the city. Okay, so that is very important. Even in context of the, like Professor Panda has rightly pointed out, that the informal sector, like largely most of the migrant work in informal sector itself. But if you see the discussion from 91 onwards, it's happening that you provide all kind of social security benefits linking through different kind of, it is not like that we haven't envisaged or made certain policies. But when it comes to the implementing or incorporating these migrants into these policy, I hope that if we could delve into that why it is so that it's not happening, that is more important. And see, despite that we have in every single urban local bodies, we have slum cell. Why not migrant cell, a special migrant cell which cater all the requirement for the migrant workers, like starting from the registration, starting from the means every single needs which they have. So and including, see, we have frame in Shiksha Abhiyan, there is a bridge schooling concept for the migrant workers children. But what is reality? That if you are a seasonal migrant and you come into the city, first of all, nobody is there to accept you in the school. Okay, this is the major problem. So to whom you will approach as a migrant, to whom you will approach, because you know that there is no agency which to whom I can approach directly. So they go to their local leaders or some social network or social capital which they have. Largely, even unfortunately, these migrants, especially who are at the lower ladder of urban labor market, they do not have the social capital also through which they can exercise these basic requirements which they should have. So precisely having an appropriate institution is also very much important and essential if we want to ensure that they get all the due benefits in the policy domain itself, which exists. Like if you have highlighted Swanidhi, and it's not the first time that we have started Street Vendor Act much larger, much earlier, and in National Urban Livelihood Mission, this is one component. But you see how many cities there have been the registration of the street vendor. There is separate zoning for the street vendor or separate zoning areas for street vending. So largely why it is so that despite the n number of policy, when it comes to the execution, it's not happening because none of the urban institution take the responsibility of ensuring that these are the citizen of the city. They are part of the city, the entire development, entire growth process of the city also. So until unless the particular institution, and it comes, if we want to incorporate into these migrants in the larger and ensure their political agency, so we have to start from the ground level organization, which is the urban local bodies. It's my belief, and there should be a certain cell which address all the need, because then all the migrant will be having at least one point of connection where they can directly approach and they can ensure, and nobody can escape the responsibility, because that will be the one cell, and that could be monitored by their local representative also. Because see, ultimately although we have ceremonial mayor and ward councillor, but at least through some way they can ensure. But here, nobody is there to whom they can approach. So this is one issue which I think personally that that should be there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arvind sir. Now coming to Srishtee ma'am. Ma'am, we have seen time and again various bodies, many times labor commissionerate, we have a few of them, they become very active. But in the times of pandemic, we have seen how they have been treated, especially by the police, I would say law and order. How do you see the institutional setup and what will be the way forward so that we mainstream our migrants? Many work has been going on, but what the political and basic rights Ashwani sir is highlighting towards making our migrant main core for our new India. How do you see also as a way forward?
Yeah. Thank you. No, I think it is very, very potent to recognize the terminology. I think it's important what COVID did for us. I think it just pulled the cat out of the hat straight away for all of us to see that there was this underlying, issue that was growing for as long as 70 years, if I may. Which brings me to a very crucial point that Sir had made about studies that globally look at and understand migrants differently. So the terms of reference become, or terms of address become very, very important. Do we look at them as migrants or immigrants? Do we entirely ignore the porosity of our borders? Because once they enter from across the border, do we treat them as international migrants? Do we look at them as cross-border migrants? Or do we largely understand them as people who have arrived into our territory and treat them as internal migrants? Because all of them remain disenfranchised. We are not actually using terminology which is inclusive. So right at the get-go, at the customs office or at the FRO office, in fact, at the local bodies, as my colleague over here was mentioning, we feel a sense of exclusion on behalf of the migrants. So the term of address, I think, needs to be relooked at, because once we look at them and address them in a particular way, then we institutionalize processes and assistance for them, for the community of the migrants, not just a piecemeal approach of saying ration card aaj de diya, kal unko voter ID mil jayega. So that needs to really be deliberated upon. And I think for that, the bureaucratic bridge building is important. And as Sir was highlighting anyway, it's the disciplinary boundaries that we have to cross over, as well as institutional boundaries. So it's the academics and the bureaucracy who can sit together and then look at and see, instances in the past where India has performed quite well. And when we look at hostility and hospitality leading to conviviality, I think we've had a very good example of the partition. When migrants crossed the border who came in, we would like to choose a term which may be a refugee or a cross-border migrant, but essentially migrants who contributed to a community and building up smaller towns and cities in the north. So I feel like this can be looked at as an inspiration for people who have actually contributed in bridging and bonding, increasing that social capital throughout our cities. With that also includes political incorporation, and that they have such a huge stake now in the city making processes. So we've had examples and instances in our own past which we can look at. Again, beautifully put by Sir in conviviality, and I think that is what we need to look at in addressing some of these issues.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Sethi. So now coming to Professor Ashwani sir. Sir, 2 points I really wanted to add and also know from you. One was that Professor Iridia Rajan sir has been highlighting that vaccination for migrant as a frontline worker should be really highlighted. How do we see, we also have COVID now, and we know how seasonal migration and how fluid the situation is. And now even 2 doses will not be enough, booster shots. Many of other, advanced countries have started. How do you see now this conundrum, especially for the migrants? And the second issue, as the dualism you have highlighted, that vote wahi dalenge, kaam yahan karenge. That is, I think, a trust issue. Even bureaucrats, policymakers, they also think what to do now. How do you see, sir, moving forward, we enable the trust in our institution, in our system, that we become really one country to give really social protection to all those who want to contribute and harness the opportunity given in our country? Ashwani sir, yes. Also your way forward, sir. And if you want to take any questions so that we can also wrap much over time. So please unmute yourself, Ashwani sir. You're on mute.
I think my fellow panelists have done a brilliant discussion today, and I don't know how to respond, because Srishtee has beautifully summed up. Of late, I have been working, Arjun, more about and speaking through in my small little efforts, the politics of conviviality. One thing is, the other aspect that I didn't touch upon, perhaps for the next edition and the next volume, we will explore that perhaps in detail with the new generation of scholars and scholarship. The interethnic, the interethnic tolerance. Despite everything, despite the, crisis created by CAG, if you look at, interethnic ties, and even in the COVID crisis, the cases, we could have done certainly better. I'm quoting Amartya. But the interethnic bonding, interethnic conviviality survived. So I think the deeper crisis, I'm going back to Professor Rajni Kothari and his seminal, his influence on all of us, growing in his era, in his time, and where he really motivated us to, and has told us that, the crisis is largely political. The origins of inevitability or disenfranchisement is political. I'm quoting Luan Jin, where Lynch work is pathbreaking in terms of the collapse of democracies across Latin America. Back in 30 years in the US, comparative class, we all heard, very closely, what Juan was saying. It's not an economic crisis, that led to the collapse. It's a political. Origins are political. That's why I'm going back to the Constituent Assembly. That's why, like, Srishtee, I'm going back to how these things have happened, look at Constitution, it's not very helpful, in terms of dealing with the regular bureaucratic obstacles and overcoming bureaucratic obstacles, registration, rejection of the forms, etc., etc. So my sense, I'm looking at some of the comments and some of the questions about rights of women, education, children, I guess, the primary reason is here, the politics, the crisis of politics. Origins are political. So unless we address that, urban planning is a different thing. Urban planning comes later, welfare comes later, you can give me one roti, one chapati, or 100 rupees, or outside the railway station, give me water. That comes later. Those are band-aid solutions, as my esteemed colleague Professor Panda knows it. But the crisis is political, and we are not dealing with it. We are not dealing with. We are not, we are not going to go ahead with hands-on approach to say that, look, one nation, one voter has to happen. If it doesn't happen, and India is a federal system. Look at even in the times of Myron Wiener in Sons of the Soil, the entire India was not torn asunder by ethnic conflict or of the Sons of the Soil conflict. Some pockets, some spaces became notorious, some became more violent, and other spaces remained peaceful. So going back to Varshney's thesis, why some cities are violent and why some cities are not violent? Why some cities, I'm posing to Arvind, is a younger scholar, and Srishtee, the next generation, they are not millennials, but they are the younger scholars. Why some cities are more hospitable and why some cities are not? I mean, this will be our, way forward to understand, analyze, and bring together synergies across disciplines, economists, demographer, geographer, political scientist, social workers. We need to work together and then learn from each other. So I stop here, and for me, Arjun, my sense is, my gut sense is, intuitive sense, Arjun, informing that the migrant crisis will continue to bother us. I'm again quoting, Kothari. He used to tell us that this will continue to agitate you, So believe me, what is happening in Northeast will continue to agitate you. What is happening in the COVID will continue to agitate you. There is no easy solution to that. Indian democracy when I say Indian democracy, in its in its most advanced stage of democracy, democratic consolidation will continue to be rattled and agitated by the disenfranchisement of the migrants. I stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And I think this discussion can go on because so much of things you have really focused. There are also regional connection because people coming from Nainital goes to a specific occupation, specific region.
I have a house there, Arjun. I have a house. I'm going to my house, and next time I will take your call from there.
Also take me then.
Most welcome, all of you.
Yes.
All of you.
And also Northeast people going to Bangalore, and we see what the kind of hue and cry and everything also happening. So really telling about the character of our country and the polity is really important. Thank you so much, Ashwani sir, and all our panelists. Now it's really time and supper time for everyone. To wrap up the session, we'll formally wrap up with a vote of thanks by Anshula Mehta, who is Senior Assistant Director at IMPRI. Anshula, why don't you proceed?
Shulaji, namaskar.
Yes.
Thank you, and on behalf of the IMPRI Center for Habitat, Urban and Regional Studies, I would once like to formally thank all of you for joining us today for this very important discussion on disenfranchised migrants and the city, theory and evidence. We are grateful to our speaker for today, Professor Ashwani Kumar, for taking up the time to join us and doing such an insightful and a thought-provoking talk. Thank you, sir. We are also grateful to our discussants, Dr. Srishtee Sethi, Dr. Arvind Pandey, and Professor Bhagirathi Panda for being with us today and for adding their perspectives to this set of deliberation. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who joined us here on Zoom or on Facebook Live, or will watch later on YouTube or listen on our podcast. We hope that you also continue to tune in to future episodes of City Communications.
Thank you, and have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Good night to each one of you.
Yes.
Thank you. Ashwani, congratulations for taking over the deanship of the, so it was very enlightening to listen to all of you. Of course, you're so brilliant, and then Srishtee and Pandey and Dr. Arjun. So
And
nice.
Arjun, I hope you are organizing a Northeast, conference soon.
We
We
will.
all join you.
We
Look forward to.
Definitely. I also look forward to that. Yeah.
And Professor Panda, so that my supervisor was Professor Sukhdev Thorat.
Okay. Oh yeah. He does a lot of process analysis. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so nice. So nice to know that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.